The morning sun rose over the dusty Wyoming hills, casting long shadows across Isaac Porter's land as he spotted movement near his henhouse, delicate fingers prying open the small door where his prized Plymouth Rock hens laid the eggs that kept his small ranch afloat during these harsh times of 1878. Whispers in the wind, the stranger froze when Isaac's shadow fell across the henhouse entrance. She was thin, too thin for someone who should be in the bloom of youth, with dirt smudged across her high cheekbones and a threadbare dress that had seen better days. Her golden brown hair was hastily tied back with a faded ribbon, and in her hands were 6 brown eggs carefully nestled in her apron. "Madam, I believe those belong to me," Isaac said, his voice firm but not unkind. At 28, he'd seen enough hardship in the Wyoming territory to recognize desperation when he saw it. The young woman's eyes widened with fear, but instead of dropping the eggs and fleeing as he expected, she stood her ground, her chin lifting slightly. "I know they're yours," she admitted, her voice soft but steady, "and I wouldn't take them if I had any other choice. I'm feeding my baby sister. She's only 3 and hasn't had proper food in days." Something in her voice, the raw honesty, perhaps made Isaac pause. Times were hard for everyone in Sweetwater County, especially since the winter had stretched longer than usual. The railroad had brought some prosperity to the territory, but not everyone had benefited. "Your sister," Isaac said slowly. "Where is she now?" "In our wagon, about half a mile east of here." She gestured vaguely with her head, never taking her eyes off him, as though she expected him to grab her at any moment. "Our parents died of fever last month. We're trying to reach our aunt in Laramie." Isaac studied her face, looking for signs of deception but finding only exhaustion and determination. Her eyes were the color of the summer sage that covered the hills, green with flecks of gold that caught the morning light. "What's your name?" he asked, taking a step back to give her space. Grace Donovan." "Well, Miss Donovan, I can't rightly let you steal my eggs." He watched her shoulders slump in defeat before he continued. "But I can invite you and your sister to breakfast, and maybe we can figure out how to get you both fed proper-like." The relief that washed over her face was almost painful to witness. You would do that for strangers?" Isaac shrugged, suddenly self-conscious under her grateful gaze. "Out here, helping neighbors is how we all survive, even temporary ones." He gestured toward the main house. "Why don't you collect a few more eggs? Then bring your sister up to the house. I make a decent breakfast, though nothing fancy." Grace hesitated. "I don't want charity." "It's not charity to feed a hungry child," Isaac replied firmly. "Besides, I could use some company. Gets lonely talking to chickens all day." The faintest smile touched Grace's lips, transforming her face and causing an unexpected tightness in Isaac's chest. "Thank you, Mr. Porter." "Isaac Porter." "Thank you, Mr. Porter. You won't regret your kindness." Isaac watched her carefully gather more eggs, her movements gentle despite her obvious hunger. Something about her dignity in the face of such hardship stirred something in him, respect, certainly, but also a protective instinct he hadn't felt in years, not since his younger brother had left for California 2 years prior. "I'll have coffee ready," he said, tipping his hat before turning toward the house. As he walked away, Isaac wondered what exactly he was getting himself into, but the image of Grace's determined eyes stayed with him, and somehow, he couldn't bring himself to regret his impulsive offer. An hour later, Isaac heard the creak of wagon wheels approaching his modest homestead. The 2-room cabin wasn't much compared to the grand houses back east, but he'd built it with his own hands, and pride swelled in his chest whenever he looked at it. The small porch faced east to catch the morning sun, and he'd even added a rocking chair last summer, though he rarely had time to use it. Grace appeared driving a weathered wagon pulled by an old mare that had clearly seen better days. Beside her sat a small girl with the same golden brown hair, though hers fell in messy curls around a face that was far too solemn for a child so young. Isaac stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Welcome," he called, trying to sound casual despite the strangeness of having visitors. It had been months since anyone had come calling, aside from the occasional traveling salesman or the neighbor 3 miles west who sometimes traded tools. Grace helped the little girl down from the wagon, whispering something in her ear that made her nod solemnly. As they approached, Isaac could see the family resemblance more clearly: the same determined chin, the same direct gaze, though the child's eyes were brown rather than green. "Mr. Porter, this is my sister, Nora," Grace said, her hand protectively on the child's shoulder. Isaac crouched down to the little girl's level. "Hello there, Miss Nora. I'm mighty pleased to meet you." Nora regarded him with solemn eyes before whispering, "Do you really have eggs?" Isaac couldn't help but smile. "I surely do. And bacon too. Are you hungry?" The child nodded enthusiastically, and some of the tension visibly drained from Grace's shoulders. "Come on in, then," Isaac said, straightening up and leading the way into his cabin. The inside was simple but neat. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a sturdy table, 4 chairs, and a small sofa near the stone fireplace. Shelves lined one wall, holding books, a few photographs, and essential supplies. The door to the bedroom was closed, but a curtained alcove revealed a small washstand. "It's not much," Isaac said, suddenly aware of how sparse his home must seem. "It's wonderful," Grace replied quietly, looking around with appreciation rather than judgment. Isaac busied himself at the iron stove where a cast iron skillet already held sizzling bacon. "Make yourselves comfortable. Breakfast will be ready shortly." He watched from the corner of his eye as Grace helped Nora wash her hands at the basin near the door before settling her at the table. The care with which she attended to her sister spoke volumes about the responsibility she had shouldered. "How old are you, Miss Grace?" Isaac asked as he cracked eggs into the hot bacon fat. 22, she answered, coming to stand near the stove. "May I help?" Isaac nodded toward a loaf of bread on the counter. "You could slice some bread if you'd like. The coffee's nearly ready too." As they worked side by side in the small kitchen, Isaac learned that Grace and Nora had been traveling for nearly 2 weeks since leaving their failed homestead near Cheyenne. Their parents had moved west with dreams of building a cattle ranch, but a harsh winter followed by sickness had claimed both of them within days of each other. "Papa always said Aunt Martha would take us in if anything happened," Grace explained, her voice steady despite the pain that flashed across her face. "She has a boarding house in Laramie. I wrote to her before we left, but I don't know if she received my letter." Isaac flipped the eggs carefully. "Laramie's still a good 4 days' journey from here, especially with that wagon and horse." "I know," Grace sighed, glancing at Nora, who was tracing patterns on the wooden table with her finger. "But we'll make it. We have to." The quiet determination in her voice impressed Isaac more than any grand declarations could have. This woman had buried her parents, packed what little she could salvage, and set out with a 3-year-old sister across dangerous territory, all without losing her dignity or resolve. When they sat down to eat, Isaac noticed how Grace made sure Nora ate first, only taking food for herself after the child had started eating. The simple meal, eggs, bacon, and bread with fresh butter, was consumed with an appreciation that made Isaac feel like he'd served a feast. "This is the best breakfast ever," Nora declared, her small face brightening as she scooped up egg yolk with a piece of bread. Isaac laughed, surprised by how good it felt to have company at his table. "Well, thank you kindly, Miss Nora." After breakfast, while Grace helped clean up despite Isaac's protests, he made a decision that surprised even himself. "The trail to Laramie passes through some rough country," he said casually as he dried a plate. Bandits sometimes trouble travelers, especially those who look vulnerable. Grace's hands stilled in the wash basin. We'll be careful. I'm sure you will, Isaac agreed. But I've been meaning to head to Laramie myself for supplies. My wagon's in good shape, and with 2 horses pulling, we'd make better time. Grace turned to look at him, suspicion flashing across her face. Why would you do that for us? You don't know us. I know enough, Isaac replied simply. I know you're trying to do right by your sister, and I know that trail isn't safe for 2 women alone. He hesitated, then added more quietly, and maybe I could use the company. The truth was, Isaac had been alone for too long. Since his brother left and his brief engagement to the schoolteacher had ended when she decided Wyoming was too wild for her tastes. He'd grown accustomed to solitude but not fond of it. Grace studied his face for a long moment, as if searching for hidden motives. Finally, she asked, "What about your farm? Your animals? My neighbor Jim can look after things for a few days. He's done it before when I've needed to travel." Isaac shrugged. Besides, summer's coming. It's a good time to be away briefly. He could see the internal struggle playing out across Grace's expressive face, pride warring with practicality, suspicion with desperate hope. "We can pay you," she said finally. "Not much, but something for your trouble." Isaac shook his head firmly. "This isn't business, Miss Donovan. Consider it neighborly assistance, nothing more." "Why?" The question was soft but direct, her green eyes searching his. Isaac thought about it for a moment. "Because someone once helped me when I needed it, and I promised I'd do the same if I ever got the chance." He smiled slightly. "Besides, I've been wanting to see if Laramie's grown as much as people say." The lie was transparent, but it gave Grace the excuse she needed to accept his help without feeling completely beholden. "When would we leave?" she asked, and Isaac knew he'd won her agreement. "Tomorrow morning, if that suits. I'll need today to make arrangements with Jim and prepare the wagon." Grace nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Porter." "Isaac," he corrected. "If we're going to be traveling together, we might as well use our given names." "Isaac," she repeated softly, and he was surprised by how good his name sounded on her lips. Later that day, after he'd ridden to Jim's place and secured his promise to look after the farm, Isaac found himself making preparations with an energy he hadn't felt in months. He packed supplies, checked his wagon's wheels, and even cleaned out the small tent he sometimes used when herding cattle on the far reaches of his property. "The ladies can use the wagon to sleep," he explained to his gelding, Boulder, as he brushed the horse's coat. "I'll manage fine with the tent." Boulder snorted as if to express doubt about his master's planning, making Isaac chuckle. "Don't you start. This is just being neighborly, nothing more." But as he worked, Isaac found himself thinking about the way Grace's eyes crinkled slightly when she smiled at her sister, how capable her hands had been as she helped with the dishes, and the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her slender frame. "Just neighborly," he muttered again, more to convince himself than the horse. That evening, he showed Grace and Nora to the small creek behind his property where they could wash up in privacy. He'd laid out some of his brother's old clothes that he'd kept, a shirt and trousers that might fit Grace better for traveling than her worn dress. "They're not fancy, but they're sturdy," he explained awkwardly. "For the journey, if you want them." Grace touched the fabric reverently. "Thank you. That's very thoughtful." Isaac busied himself preparing a hearty stew for dinner, trying not to think about Grace changing into his brother's clothes down by the creek. When they returned, Nora's face was scrubbed clean, her curls damp, and Isaac nearly dropped the wooden spoon he was holding. The trousers had been rolled up several times at the ankles but fit well enough around her waist with the help of a belt. The blue cotton shirt was too large, so she tied it at her waist, and with her hair freshly braided, she looked transformed. Not like a fine lady from town, but like a frontier woman capable, strong, and undeniably beautiful. "Is this acceptable?" Grace asked, clearly uncertain about wearing men's clothing. Isaac cleared his throat. "Very practical for traveling. You'll be more comfortable than in skirts." Nora twirled in her freshly washed dress. "Grace looks like a cowboy." Isaac laughed. "Not quite. She needs a hat for that." Impulsively, he took his spare hat from a hook by the door and placed it on Grace's head. It was too large and slipped down over her eyes, making Nora giggle and Grace smile despite her embarrassment. "Now you're a proper Wyoming traveler," Isaac said, ignoring the warm feeling spreading through his chest at the sight of her in his hat. That night, after Nora had fallen asleep on the small sofa, Grace and Isaac sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. The spring air was cool but not uncomfortable, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. "I never thanked you properly," Grace said suddenly, her voice quiet in the stillness. "For what?" "For not turning me in when you caught me stealing. You would have been within your rights." Isaac leaned back in his chair, considering. "I've never been one for strict interpretations of rights when someone's in need." He glanced at her profile, silvered by the rising moon. "Besides, you weren't stealing for yourself. That makes a difference." Grace was silent for a long moment before speaking again. "After our parents died, I kept thinking someone would help us. The neighbors, the church, someone. But everyone has their own troubles, their own mouths to feed." Her voice held no bitterness, only a sad acceptance. "By the time I realized we were truly on our own, our food was nearly gone." "It's a hard country," Isaac agreed. "Beautiful, but unforgiving. Is that why you live alone?" Grace asked, then immediately shook her head. "I'm sorry, that's too personal a question." Isaac surprised himself by answering anyway. "Partly. My brother Daniel left for California 2 years ago. Wanted to try his luck in the gold fields. Before that, I was engaged to the schoolteacher in town, but she decided Wyoming was too wild and went back east." "I'm sorry," Isaac shrugged. "Don't be. She was probably right. This isn't an easy place for a woman used to city comforts." Grace turned to look at him directly. "Some women are stronger than men give them credit for." Their eyes met in the darkness, and Isaac felt a connection that both thrilled and terrified him. "I'm beginning to see that," he said softly. The moments stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities, until Grace looked away, back toward the star-filled sky. "We should get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Isaac nodded, rising from his chair. "You and Nora take the bedroom. I'll be fine out here." "We couldn't possibly." "I insist," Isaac interrupted gently. "The sofa's comfortable enough for me." Grace stood, hesitating at the door. "Thank you, Isaac, for everything. Sleep well, Grace." As he settled onto the sofa later, listening to the quiet house and the distant cry of a coyote, Isaac wondered at the strange turn his life had taken in a single day. He'd begun the morning alone, as he had been for months, and now his home contained a woman who intrigued him more than anyone he'd met in years, and a solemn little girl who had actually laughed at dinner. It was temporary, he reminded himself firmly. A few days of travel, then they would reach Laramie and part ways. Grace would start her new life with her aunt, and he would return to his solitary existence. But as sleep claimed him, Isaac couldn't help but wonder what it might be like if things were different, if his house could always contain the sounds of Nora's laughter and the sight of Grace's rare but radiant smile. Dawn broke clear and crisp the next morning. Isaac had risen early to prepare the wagon, loading their supplies and ensuring everything was secure for the journey ahead. By the time Grace emerged from the bedroom with a sleepy Nora in tow, he had breakfast waiting and coffee brewing on the stove. "You're up early," Grace observed, helping Nora wash her face in the basin. Habit, Isaac replied. Can't seem to sleep past sunrise no matter how hard I try. They ate quickly, and Isaac noticed that Grace seemed more at ease this morning, some of yesterday's wariness having faded. Nora, too, chattered more freely, asking Isaac questions about his horses and whether they might see buffalo on their journey. Not likely, he told her gently. The great herds are mostly gone now, but we might see antelope or deer if we're lucky. After breakfast, they loaded the last of their belongings. Grace insisted on bringing her small trunk, which contained, she explained, the few mementos she'd been able to save from their parents' homestead. Family Bible, mother's wedding ring, father's pocket watch, she said quietly when Nora was out of earshot. Not worth much to anyone else, but they're all Nora will have to remember them by. Isaac helped her secure the trunk in the wagon, struck by her foresight in preserving these connections to the past for her sister. It spoke of a care that went beyond mere survival. They set out as the sun cleared the eastern hills, the wagon rolling smoothly along the rutted trail that would eventually join with the main road to Laramie. Isaac drove the team while Grace sat beside him, Nora between them, her small face alight with excitement at the adventure. The first few miles passed in companionable silence, broken only by Nora's occasional questions or exclamations at the sight of a rabbit or hawk. The Wyoming landscape spread around them, vast and open, the rolling hills covered in spring grasses and wildflowers, the distant mountains still capped with snow. It's beautiful, Grace said softly, following Isaac's gaze toward the horizon. I forgot to notice that these past weeks. Easy to miss beauty when you're worried about survival, Isaac replied. But it's always there, waiting to be seen again. Grace studied him with a thoughtful expression. You speak like someone who's had time to think about such things. Isaac smiled slightly. Not much else to do on long winter nights but think. Or read. My father believed education shouldn't stop just because we moved west, so we brought as many books as we could carry. You were fortunate. My father could barely write his name, though he made sure I learned my letters from my mother before she passed. Is that when you took on raising Nora? When your mother died? Grace nodded, her hand automatically reaching to smooth Nora's curls. Mother died when Nora was just a year old. Childbirth fever. The baby it would have been a boy didn't survive either. I'm sorry, Isaac said, hearing the old grief in her voice. Father did his best, but a man alone with a baby. She shrugged. I was 19, old enough to step in. Isaac watched how naturally she comforted Nora when the wagon hit a rough patch, how the child instinctively turned to her for security. You've done well by her. Anyone can see that. A flush of pleasure colored Grace's cheeks at the compliment. I've tried. Sometimes I worry it's not enough. It's more than many get, Isaac said quietly, thinking of his own mother who had died when he was 12, leaving him and Daniel in their father's stern but loving care. They stopped at midday beside a small stream to rest the horses and eat a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and dried apple slices that Isaac had packed. Nora delighted in wading in the shallow water, carefully rolling up her dress as Grace had shown her. She seems happy, Isaac observed as they sat on a fallen log watching the child. She adapts quickly. Children do, I suppose. Grace's voice held a note of wonder. After everything, she can still find joy in a stream and a sunny day. And you? Isaac asked before he could stop himself. Can you still find joy? Grace seemed surprised by the question. I haven't thought about it. There's been so much to do, so many decisions. But before your parents died. She considered this, her brow furrowing slightly. I used to sing, every evening while doing chores. Father said I had mother's voice. A small, sad smile touched her lips. I haven't sung since they died. Isaac wanted to tell her he'd like to hear her sing someday, But the words felt too intimate, too presumptuous. Instead, he said, "Perhaps you will again when you're settled in Laramie." Grace nodded, but her expression suggested she wasn't convinced. Perhaps. They continued their journey through the afternoon, making good progress along the increasingly well-traveled road. By evening, they had reached a small settlement consisting of a trading post, a livery stable, and a handful of rough cabins. "Willow Creek," Isaac explained as they approached. "Not much of a town, but the trading post has fair prices and there's a safe place to camp by the creek." The trading post owner, a gruff man named Harkins with a surprisingly gentle manner toward Nora, directed them to a flat area near the creek where other travelers sometimes camped. Isaac set up his tent a respectful distance from the wagon, which he arranged so Grace and Nora could sleep inside protected from the elements. As darkness fell, they sat around a small campfire, eating a hot meal Isaac had prepared over the flames. Nora, exhausted from the day's travel, fell asleep almost as soon as she'd finished eating, curled up on a blanket near the fire. "She trusts you," Grace commented as Isaac gently carried the sleeping child to the wagon and tucked her into the makeshift bed they'd prepared. "Children and dogs," Isaac said with a self-deprecating smile when he returned to the fire. "They've always taken to me for some reason." "It's because you're kind," Grace said simply. "People can sense that, especially children." The directness of her assessment made Isaac uncomfortable, unused as he was to personal conversations. He poked at the fire, sending sparks flying upward into the night sky. "What will you do in Laramie?" he asked, changing the subject. "Besides staying with your aunt, I mean." Grace wrapped her arms around her knees, staring into the flames. "Find work, I suppose. I can sew reasonably well, and if Aunt Martha truly runs a boarding house as Father said, perhaps I can help there." "And Nora?" "School when she's old enough." Grace's voice took on a determined edge. "She'll learn to read and write properly, not pieced together like my education was." Isaac nodded, understanding the fierce desire to give the child opportunities that had been denied to Grace herself. "Laramie has a good school now, from what I hear. The territory's growing up." "And you?" Grace asked, turning his question back on him. "What keeps you on that farm all alone?" Isaac hadn't expected the question, though he should have. "It's mine," he said simply. "Every board in that house, every fence post, every acre I worked for it. My father homesteaded nearby when Daniel and I were boys. When I was 20, I staked my own claim." Pride crept into his voice despite his attempt at casualness. "It's not much compared to the big cattle spreads, but it's mine free and clear." "That's no small achievement," Grace said with genuine admiration. "But doesn't it get lonely?" The question hit closer to home than Isaac was comfortable with. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but there's always work to be done. Keeps the mind occupied." "But not the heart," Grace said softly, almost to herself. Their eyes met across the fire, and Isaac felt that same connection he'd experienced on the porch the night before, a recognition that went beyond mere acquaintance. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to return home to his cabin with Grace and Nora, to build a life together instead of existing in solitude. The thought both tempted and terrified him. "We should get some rest," he said, breaking the spell of the moment. "We've got another long day tomorrow." Grace nodded, rising gracefully to her feet. "Good night, Isaac." "Good night, Grace." As he lay in his tent later, listening to the murmur of the creek and the occasional distant howl of a coyote, Isaac acknowledged to himself that he was in dangerous territory not because of bandits or wild animals, but because of the emotions beginning to stir within him. Emotions he'd sworn not to indulge again after Eleanor had left him for the comforts of Philadelphia. Grace was different from Eleanor in every way: practical where the schoolteacher had been dreamy, strong where Eleanor had been delicate, committed to her responsibilities where Eleanor had fled from them. But that didn't mean Grace would choose to stay in Wyoming either, especially not on a modest farm with a man she barely knew. She has plans, Isaac reminded himself sternly. A future in Laramie with her aunt. Your job is to get her there safely, nothing more. But as sleep finally claimed him, his dreams were filled with green eyes and the sound of a voice that hadn't sung in too long. The next morning dawned gray and threatening, with heavy clouds hanging low over the landscape. Isaac frowned at the sky as he prepared a quick breakfast over the rekindled fire. Looks like rain, Grace observed, joining him with Nora's hand in hers. The child was still sleepy, rubbing her eyes with her free hand. More than rain, I'm thinking, Isaac replied, handing them each a tin cup of hot coffee, weakened with plenty of milk for Nora. Those clouds have the look of a spring storm. We should reach Coyote Station by midday if we push on. They have a proper inn where we can wait it out if needed. They ate quickly and broke camp as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Isaac helped Grace and Nora into the wagon, then covered their supplies with an oiled canvas to keep them dry. By the time they pulled away from the campsite, the rain was falling steadily, drumming on the wagon's canvas cover. The trail quickly became muddy, slowing their progress as the horses worked harder to pull the wagon through the increasingly difficult terrain. Nora huddled against Grace, her earlier excitement dampened by the gloomy weather and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Will the horses be all right? Grace asked as Boulder shied slightly at a particularly loud thunderclap. They're steady animals, Isaac assured her, though he kept a firm hand on the reins. I've driven them through worse. The rain intensified as the morning wore on, turning from a steady downpour to a driving torrent that made it difficult to see more than a few yards ahead. The trail, never particularly well marked in this section, became increasingly hard to follow. Isaac squinted through the rain, trying to identify familiar landmarks. They should be approaching a distinctive rock formation that marked the halfway point to Coyote Station, but the limited visibility made navigation challenging. Are we lost? Grace asked quietly, pitching her voice so that Nora, who had fallen into an uneasy sleep against her side, wouldn't hear. Not lost, Isaac replied with more confidence than he felt. Just proceeding cautiously. Grace's small smile told him she saw through his bravado, but she didn't challenge him further. Instead, she said, I trust you'll get us where we need to go. The simple statement of faith warmed Isaac more than it should have, giving him renewed determination to justify her trust. He focused intently on the trail ahead, finally spotting the dark outline of the rock formation through the curtain of rain. There, he said with relief, we're on the right track. Coyote Station's about 5 miles ahead. As if in response to their progress, the storm intensified. Lightning split the sky in jagged white streaks, followed almost immediately by deafening thunder that made the horses skittish and woke Nora with a frightened cry. It's all right, sweetheart, Grace soothed, holding the child close. Just the sky making noise. Isaac fought to control the nervous horses while keeping the wagon on the increasingly treacherous trail. A particularly violent gust of wind rocked the wagon, making Nora whimper and clutch Grace more tightly. Maybe we should stop until the worst passes, Grace suggested, concern evident in her voice. Isaac was about to agree when a flash of lightning illuminated the landscape ahead, revealing a swollen creek where the trail crossed what should have been a modest stream. The water was already spilling over its banks, and as they watched, a section of the bank collapsed into the rushing current. We can't stop here, Isaac decided. That creek's rising fast, and we're in the bottom of a draw. If it keeps raining like this, we could be in trouble. He pointed ahead and to the right. There's higher ground about a half-mile that way. We'll head there and wait out the storm. Grace nodded her understanding, one arm still around Nora, The other braced against the wagon seat as Isaac turned the team toward the slope he'd indicated. The going was slow and difficult, the wagon wheels slipping in the mud as they climbed away from the draw. Lightning struck a tree not 50 yards away, the crack and sizzle making the horses rear in panic. Isaac fought to control them, muscles straining as he held the reins tight. "Whoa, steady now," he called to the frightened animals, his voice calm despite the danger. "Steady, boys." Grace joined in, her clear voice somehow cutting through the storm's noise as she spoke soothingly to the horses. Gradually, they settled, though they remained nervous, eyes rolling as they responded to Isaac's guidance. "You're good with them," Isaac observed as they continued their careful progress toward higher ground. "My father raised horses before he got the notion to try cattle," Grace explained. "I helped break colts from the time I was 14. The casual revelation of her skill impressed Isaac, who knew how dangerous and difficult that work could be. This woman was continually surprising him with her capabilities. They finally reached the higher ground Isaac had spotted, a small plateau with a stand of pines that offered some shelter from the driving rain. Isaac maneuvered the wagon beneath the largest trees, then jumped down to secure the horses. "We'll wait here until the storm passes," he told Grace as he helped her and Nora down from the wagon. "It's safer than trying to ford that creek in this weather." The three of them huddled in the wagon, protected somewhat by its canvas cover though the wind occasionally drove rain through the openings. Isaac produced a small flask from his coat and offered it to Grace. "Whiskey," he explained at her questioning look. "Just a sip to warm you." Grace hesitated, then took the flask and swallowed a small amount, grimacing slightly at the burn. "Thank you." Isaac took a sip himself before stowing the flask back in his coat. "Sorry about the delay. I should have anticipated the storm." "No one can predict the weather with certainty," Grace replied practically. "We're safe and dry enough. That's what matters." Her calm acceptance of their situation, without blame or complaint, struck Isaac forcefully. Eleanor would have been distraught at such a delay, fretting about her appearance and comfort. Grace simply adjusted to the circumstances and moved forward. The storm raged for another hour before beginning to abate, the thunder moving eastward and the rain gradually lessening to a steady drizzle. When it seemed safe enough, Isaac ventured out to check on the horses and survey their surroundings. The landscape had been transformed by the deluge. Small streams had formed where none existed before, cutting channels through the prairie soil. In the distance, Isaac could see that the creek they had avoided crossing was now a raging torrent, well beyond its banks. "We made the right decision stopping," he told Grace when he returned to the wagon. "That creek would have swept us away if we tried to cross." Grace stepped down from the wagon to see for herself, gasping at the sight of the floodwaters in the distance. "We would never have made it across." "No," Isaac agreed soberly. "But now we have another problem. The main trails likely flooded in several places between here and Coyote Station. What do we do?" Isaac considered their options. "There's another route, but it's longer and rougher. Takes us up through the hills rather than following the valley. We'd have to camp another night before reaching Coyote Station." "Is it safe?" "Safe enough, especially now that the storm's passing. Just slower and less traveled." Grace looked back at Nora, who was watching them anxiously from the wagon. "Whatever you think is best. I trust your judgment." There it was again, that simple statement of trust that affected Isaac so strongly. He nodded, decision made. "We'll take the hill route. The ground will be firmer up there, less likely to mire the wagon." They set out again as the clouds began to break, shafts of sunlight piercing through to illuminate the rain-washed landscape. The alternative route Isaac chose led them away from the flooded valley and up into the rolling hills that flanked it to the north. The going was indeed slower, the trail less defined and occasionally steep enough to require both Isaac and Grace to walk alongside the wagon to spare the horses. But by late afternoon, they had made good progress and found themselves in beautiful country, high meadows carpeted with wildflowers that the rain had made more vivid, and views that stretched for miles across the Wyoming territory. "It's like we're on top of the world," Nora exclaimed when they stopped to rest the horses at a particularly scenic overlook. Isaac smiled at the child's wonder. "Feels that way sometimes up here." As Grace helped Nora explore a patch of bright blue larkspur blooming near the trail, Isaac found himself watching them with a curious ache in his chest. There was something right about them being here, something that felt like possibilities he hadn't allowed himself to consider for a long time. They made camp that evening in a protected hollow near a small spring. The storm had cleared the air, leaving the sky a deep, clear blue that promised a spectacular sunset. Isaac set up the tent and started a fire while Grace prepared a simple meal from their supplies. After they ate, as twilight deepened around them, Nora begged for a story. To Isaac's surprise, Grace turned to him. "Do you know any stories, Isaac?" "I've told all mine so many times." Nora could recite them herself. Put on the spot, Isaac hesitated. "I'm not much of a storyteller." "Please," Nora asked, her brown eyes wide and hopeful. Unable to resist the child's plea, Isaac searched his memory for something appropriate. "Well, there is one my father used to tell us about how the beaver got his flat tail." As he related the old tale, embellishing where his memory failed, Isaac was rewarded by Nora's rapt attention and Grace's small, appreciative smile. When he finished, Nora clapped her hands in delight. "Another one." "That's enough for tonight," Grace said firmly. "Time for sleep. We have more traveling tomorrow." After Grace had settled Nora in the wagon, she returned to the fire where Isaac sat, enjoying the peaceful evening. The first stars had appeared in the darkening sky, with more emerging by the minute. "Thank you for the story," Grace said, settling beside him on the fallen log he dragged near the fire. "She's never had a man tell her stories before. Father wasn't the type." "I enjoyed it," Isaac admitted. "Been a long time since I've had an audience for anything." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the fire and the emerging stars. The night was cool but not cold, the air fragrant with pine and sage. "May I ask you something personal?" Grace said finally, her voice quiet in the stillness. Isaac tensed slightly but nodded. "You can ask." "The schoolteacher you were engaged to, why did she really leave?" The question caught him off guard. "I told you. She found Wyoming too wild for her tastes." Grace shook her head slightly. "There's more to it than that, I think." Isaac stared into the fire, considering how much to reveal. "She wanted me to sell the farm and move back east with her," he said finally. "Said there was no future here for people like us." "People like you?" "Educated people," she meant. "People who read books and appreciated art and music." He shrugged, trying to make light of it. She wasn't entirely wrong. "It's a hard life out here, especially for women used to certain comforts." "But you couldn't leave," Grace observed. "No." The word came out more forcefully than he'd intended. "This land is part of me now. I've put too much of myself into it to walk away." Grace nodded, understanding in her eyes. "That's how my father felt about his dreams of a cattle ranch. Even when it was clear the land couldn't support it, he wouldn't give up." "Was he wrong to hold on?" Isaac asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Grace considered the question carefully. "Not wrong exactly, just unrealistic, perhaps. He couldn't see that sometimes dreams need to change to survive." The insight struck Isaac deeply. Wasn't that what Eleanor had been asking of him, not to abandon his dreams entirely, but to adapt them to include her needs as well? He hadn't been willing to consider it then, seeing only the request to leave his land, not the desire to build a life together on terms they both could accept. "You're wiser than I was at your age," he said finally. Grace laughed softly. "Not wisdom, just hard experience." She stood, brushing off her borrowed trousers. "I should get some sleep. Dawn comes early." "Grace," Isaac said, impulsively catching her hand as she turned to go. The touch sent an unexpected warmth through him. "Thank you for talking with me like this." She looked down at their joined hands, then back to his face, her expression unreadable in the firelight. "Thank you for listening." For a moment, they stood connected by that simple touch, something unspoken passing between them. Then Grace gently withdrew her hand and walked to the wagon, leaving Isaac to wonder at the emotions stirring within him. The next morning brought clear skies and a renewed determination to reach Coyote Station by nightfall. They broke camp early and continued along the hill route Isaac had chosen, the going easier now that the ground had dried somewhat overnight. As they traveled, Isaac found himself increasingly aware of Grace beside him on the wagon seat, the way she held herself straight despite the rough trail, how she pointed out interesting sights to Nora, the occasional brush of her arm against his when the wagon hit a particularly rough patch. By midday, they could see Coyote Station in the distance, a cluster of buildings nestled in a valley where two creeks joined. The town was larger than Willow Creek, boasting not only a trading post and livery stable but also a small hotel, a saloon, and several permanent residences. "It's bigger than I expected," Grace commented as they approached. "It's grown in the last few years," Isaac explained. "The stage line added it as a regular stop last year. Brings more business, more settlers." They arrived in town by late afternoon, the main street muddy but passable after the previous day's storm. Isaac guided the wagon to the modest hotel, a two-story clapboard building with a wide porch and a sign declaring, "Clean rooms, reasonable rates." "We'll stay here tonight," he said, helping Grace and Nora down from the wagon. "Get a proper meal and real beds. Tomorrow's journey to Laramie will be easier, the road's better maintained from here on." The hotel proprietor, a portly man named Peterson, greeted them with professional courtesy, though Isaac noticed his curious glance at Grace's attire. Without comment, he assigned them 2 rooms, one for the ladies and one for the gentlemen. After settling in, the rooms were indeed clean, if sparsely furnished. They met for dinner in the hotel's small dining room. Grace had changed back into her dress, though Isaac thought she looked less comfortable in it than she had in the trousers. "Appearances matter in town," she said quietly when she noticed his questioning look. "Even small towns like this one." The meal was simple but well-prepared: roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread with apple pie for dessert. Nora ate with enthusiasm, clearly enjoying the novelty of dining in a hotel. Several other travelers occupied the dining room, including a cattle buyer from Cheyenne and a drummer selling patent medicines. After dinner, while Grace took Nora upstairs to prepare for bed, Isaac stepped onto the hotel porch to enjoy a quiet smoke and contemplate the final leg of their journey. Tomorrow they would reach Laramie, and his time with Grace and Nora would end. The thought brought an unexpected pang of regret. "Mind if I join you?" Isaac turned to find Grace standing in the doorway, the light from inside illuminating her slender figure. "Please do," he replied, quickly extinguishing his cigarette. "Is Nora asleep?" "Almost before her head hit the pillow," Grace said with a small smile, coming to stand beside him at the porch railing. The excitement of staying in a hotel was almost too much for her. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the quiet activity of the small town, a few men entering or leaving the saloon across the street, a woman hurrying home with a basket of purchases, the livery stable owner checking his premises before retiring for the night. "Thank you," Grace said suddenly, "for everything you've done for us. I don't know how we would have managed without your help." "You'd have managed," Isaac replied with certainty. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." Grace shook her head slightly. Perhaps. But it would have been much harder and possibly dangerous. You've made our journey not just safer but pleasant. The simple word carried more weight than elaborate praise might have. Isaac felt that now familiar warmth spreading through his chest at her genuine appreciation. It's been pleasant for me too, he admitted. More than pleasant. Their eyes met in the soft lamplight spilling from the hotel windows, and Isaac found himself noticing details he'd missed before: the tiny flecks of gold in her green eyes, the small scar at the corner of her mouth, the way her hair curled slightly at her temples despite the severe braid she wore. "Grace," he began, not entirely sure what he wanted to say but feeling the need to say something, to acknowledge the connection that had grown between them over these few days. She waited, her expression open and attentive, but whatever Isaac might have said was interrupted by the hotel door opening as the cattle buyer stepped out onto the porch, nodding politely to them before lighting a cigar. The moment broken, Grace stepped back slightly. "I should check on Nora. Good night, Isaac." "Good night, Grace," he replied, watching her disappear back into the hotel with a sense of missed opportunity. Later, lying in the unfamiliar bed and listening to the occasional sounds from the street below, Isaac confronted the truth he'd been avoiding. He was falling in love with Grace Donovan. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. In just a few days, this woman had awakened feelings he'd thought safely buried after Eleanor's departure. But what could he offer her? A small farm miles from the nearest town, a life of hard work and isolation, exactly the future that had driven Eleanor away. Grace deserved better than that, especially after all she'd already endured. And yet, she wasn't Eleanor. Grace had proven herself capable of facing hardship with courage and dignity. She understood the land and its demands in a way the schoolteacher never had. Most importantly, she put family above all else. Her dedication to Nora showed the depth of her capacity for love and sacrifice. Could she possibly consider a life with him? The question kept Isaac awake long into the night, torn between hope and the fear of rejection. Morning brought no clear answers, only the practical necessities of continuing their journey. After a hearty breakfast, they loaded their belongings back into the wagon and set out on the final leg to Laramie. The road was indeed better maintained, allowing them to make good time despite occasional muddy patches from the recent storm. As they traveled, Isaac found himself growing increasingly quiet, preoccupied with thoughts of their impending separation and what, if anything, he should say to Grace before they parted. She seemed to sense his mood, keeping the conversation light and focused mainly on pointing out interesting sights to Nora. By mid-afternoon, the first buildings of Laramie came into view, a proper town with several streets, numerous businesses, and the unmistakable sign of prosperity in the form of new construction at its edges. The railroad had transformed what had once been little more than a stage stop into a growing center of commerce for the territory. "It's bigger than I imagined," Grace said, a hint of apprehension in her voice. "The railroads brought changes," Isaac explained. "New people, new businesses. It's not the wild place it was even 5 years ago." He guided the wagon through the busy main street, past the imposing Union Pacific Depot where a train stood waiting, steam hissing from its massive engine. Nora watched wide-eyed as passengers boarded and disembarked, luggage being loaded and unloaded under the supervision of uniformed railroad employees. "Do you know where your aunt's boarding house is located?" Isaac asked, realizing he should have inquired earlier. Grace produced a carefully folded letter from her pocket. "The last letter we received from her mentioned Cedar Street. She said everyone in town knows Martha's boarding house." A few inquiries directed them to a neat 2-story building on a quiet side street, its white clapboard exterior freshly painted, and a small sign by the door identifying it as Martha's Boarding House. Clean, respectable accommodations. Isaac felt a curious reluctance as he pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the boarding house. This was their destination, the end of their journey together, yet he found himself wishing for some reason to delay the inevitable parting. Before he could speak, the front door opened and a tall, silver-haired woman emerged onto the porch. She squinted at them for a moment before her face transformed with recognition and surprise. "Grace? Is that you, child?" Grace stood up in the wagon, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. "Aunt Martha?" The woman hurried down the steps, moving with remarkable agility for someone of her apparent years. "Glory be, it is you, and this must be little Nora. Oh, I've been so worried since I got your letter about your parents." She helped Grace and Nora down from the wagon, embracing them both with tears in her eyes. Isaac watched the reunion from his seat, feeling suddenly like an intruder on a private family moment. "And who is this gentleman?" Martha asked finally, turning her attention to Isaac. Grace introduced him, explaining briefly how he had helped them journey from his farm near Sweetwater to Laramie. Martha's expression warmed as she extended her hand to him. "Mr. Porter, I'm in your debt for bringing my nieces safely to me. Please, won't you come inside? You must be tired and hungry after your journey." Isaac hesitated, looking at Grace, who nodded encouragingly. "Thank you, madam. I'd be obliged for a cup of coffee before I head back." Inside, the boarding house was as neat and well-maintained as its exterior suggested. The front parlor was modestly but comfortably furnished, with several comfortable chairs, a small writing desk, and a cabinet containing books and a few decorative items. The smell of fresh bread and coffee permeated the air. While Martha took Nora to the kitchen for milk and cookies, fussing over the child with obvious delight, Grace and Isaac were left momentarily alone in the parlor. "Your aunt seems very kind," Isaac observed, standing awkwardly by the fireplace. "Yes," Grace agreed, her relief evident. "Father always spoke highly of her, but I wasn't sure. It's been so many years since we've seen her." An uncomfortable silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts and emotions. Isaac cleared his throat, searching for the right words. "Grace, Isaac," I wanted. They both spoke at once, then stopped, sharing a small, nervous laugh. "Please go ahead," Isaac said. Grace took a deep breath. "I wanted to thank you again. Not just for bringing us here, but for showing kindness when you found me stealing your eggs. Many men would have treated the situation very differently." "I'm glad I found you," Isaac said simply, the words carrying more meaning than he'd intended. Their eyes met, and Isaac saw in Grace's expression a complexity of emotions that mirrored his own gratitude. Certainly, but also something deeper, something that had grown between them during their days of travel. Before either could speak further, Martha returned with Nora, who was happily munching on a cookie. "Mr. Porter, won't you stay for dinner? It's the least I can offer after all you've done for my nieces." Isaac glanced at Grace, who was watching him with an unreadable expression. "Thank you, Miss," Martha corrected with a smile. "Never found a man worth changing my name for, but please call me Martha." "Thank you, Miss Martha," Isaac amended. "But I should be going. I've imposed on your hospitality enough, and I have arrangements to make in town before heading back tomorrow." Martha looked disappointed but nodded. "Of course, you must have your own responsibilities waiting. But please know you're welcome here any time you're in Laramie." Isaac thanked her, then turned to say goodbye to Nora, who surprised him by throwing her arms around his legs in a fierce hug. "Will you come visit us, Isaac?" she asked, looking up at him with trust and affection that tugged at his heart. Isaac crouched down to her level. "If I'm ever in Laramie again, I'll be sure to stop by and see how you're doing, Miss Nora." Satisfied with this promise, the child released him and returned to Martha's side. Isaac straightened, finally turning to Grace. "I'll help you bring in your trunk," he said, grasping at the practical task to delay the final goodbye. Outside, as they stood beside the wagon, Isaac found himself unable to simply unload the trunk and leave. The words he'd been holding back all day pressed against his lips, demanding release. "Grace," he began, his voice low and urgent. "I know we've only known each other a short time, but these past days, they've meant something to me, more than I expected." Grace's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't interrupt. "I understand you have plans here with your aunt and Nora," Isaac continued, "and I wouldn't ask you to change them, but I wanted you to know that if things don't work out as you hope, or if you ever find yourself wanting a different kind of life." He faltered, then forced himself to continue. "My door is open to you, both of you." The words hung in the air between them, inadequate but sincere. Isaac watched Grace's face, trying to read her reaction, hoping he hadn't overstepped or misinterpreted the connection he'd felt growing between them. "Isaac," she said finally, her voice soft but steady, "I don't know what to say. This is all so sudden, and we've known each other such a short time." "I know," he acknowledged, "and I'm not asking for an answer now. Just think about it, please." Grace studied his face for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I will think about it, I promise." It wasn't the response he'd hoped for in his most optimistic moments, but it wasn't rejection either. Isaac helped her unload the trunk, carrying it into the boarding house where Martha directed him to leave it in the small room that would be Grace and Nora's. When the time came for final goodbyes, Isaac shook Martha's hand, ruffled Nora's hair, and finally turned to Grace. On impulse, he took her hand and pressed it briefly to his lips, a gesture more formal than the embrace he longed for, but one that conveyed his respect and affection. "Goodbye, Grace," he said softly. "Take care of yourself and Nora." "Goodbye, Isaac," she replied, her eyes holding his for a moment longer than necessary. "And thank you for everything." As he drove away from the boarding house, Isaac felt a curious mixture of emotions, the pain of separation tempered by the hope that this might not be their final goodbye. He had planted a seed, however small, and now all he could do was wait to see if it would grow. The next morning, Isaac completed his business in Laramie, purchasing supplies he couldn't get in the smaller settlements near his farm and arranging for delivery of a new plow he'd ordered months ago. He deliberately avoided Cedar Street, giving Grace the space and time he'd promised, though every fiber of his being wanted to return and press his case more forcefully. By mid-afternoon, he was ready to begin the journey home. The wagon was loaded with supplies, the horses rested and eager to move. Isaac climbed onto the seat, took up the reins, and was about to signal the team to start when a familiar voice called his name. "Isaac, wait!" He turned to see Grace hurrying toward him, her skirts gathered in one hand to allow her to move more quickly. His heart leaped at the sight of her, then settled into a steady, hopeful rhythm. "Grace," he said as she reached the wagon, slightly breathless from her haste. "Is everything all right?" Nora's fine," Grace assured him. "She's with Aunt Martha." She hesitated, then continued with determination. "I needed to speak with you before you left." Isaac set the reins down and gave her his full attention, trying not to let hope cloud his judgment. "I'm listening." Grace took a deep breath. "Last night, after you left, Aunt Martha and I talked for hours. About my parents, about Nora's future, and about what might be best for all of us." She paused, and Isaac waited, not daring to interrupt. "Aunt Martha is not well," Grace continued. "She hides it well, but she's been having heart troubles for some time. The doctor has told her she should sell the boarding house and live more quietly." "I'm sorry to hear that," Isaac said, genuinely concerned. Grace nodded. "She kept it from us, not wanting to burden us with her problems when we were already dealing with so much. But the truth is, taking on the responsibility of raising Nora and helping me establish ourselves here would be too much for her. Isaac began to understand the purpose of her visit. And so you're considering other options? Yes. Grace met his eyes directly. Including your offer. Hope surged within Isaac, but he tempered it with caution. Grace, I want you to be certain. This isn't a decision to make hastily, out of necessity. I know that, she replied with quiet dignity. And I haven't. Aunt Martha has offered to sell the boarding house and come with us, if there's room for her too. She's always wanted to live in the country again, she says. The implications of her words registered slowly. Us, Isaac repeated. A smile touched Grace's lips, tentative but genuine. If your offer still stands. For all of us. Isaac found himself suddenly breathless, as if he'd been running uphill. It does, he managed. Of course it does. But Grace, I need to be sure. Is this what you want? Not just what's practical or necessary. Grace stepped closer to the wagon, resting her hand on its side. When you found me stealing your eggs, I was at my lowest point, desperate, afraid, seeing no way forward. You showed me kindness when I least expected it and most needed it. Her voice softened. During our journey, I came to admire your strength, your gentleness with Nora, your goodness, Isaac. She looked down briefly, then back up to meet his eyes. I can't promise I love you yet, it's too soon for that. But I can promise that the feelings growing in me are real and true. With time, I believe they could become something lasting. It was more than Isaac had dared hope for, not a declaration of undying love, but something perhaps more valuable. Honesty and the promise of a future they could build together. That's enough for me, he said, his voice rough with emotion. More than enough. Acting on impulse, he jumped down from the wagon and stood before her, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, the slight tremble of her lips. Grace Donovan, he said formally. I'm asking you properly now. Will you and Nora and your Aunt Martha too come back to Sweetwater with me? Not just as a practical solution, but because I believe we could build something good together. Something lasting. Grace's smile bloomed fully now, transforming her face with a joy that took Isaac's breath away. Yes, she said simply. We will. The space between them vanished as Isaac pulled her gently into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that sealed their agreement more effectively than any words could have. It was a gentle kiss, respectful of their new understanding, but it contained the promise of deeper passion to come as their relationship grew. When they parted, Grace's cheeks were flushed, and Isaac knew his own face must show the emotion he was feeling. We should go tell Aunt Martha and Nora, Grace said, a new lightness in her voice. They'll be waiting for news. Isaac offered his arm, which she took with a smile that suggested she found the formality amusing but pleasant. As they walked toward Cedar Street, Isaac felt as though the future had suddenly opened before him, bright with possibilities he had ceased to imagine for himself. The house will need expanding, he mused. Another bedroom at least for Martha. And the garden should be enlarged. I can help with that, Grace offered. Mother taught me about kitchen gardens. And Nora will love helping with the chickens. We'll make it work, Isaac said with certainty. Together. The word held new meaning now, a promise and a commitment that went beyond the practical arrangements they were discussing. Together they would face whatever challenges came, building a life neither had expected but both now embraced. Martha and Nora received the news with joy, the older woman with knowing satisfaction, as if she had anticipated this outcome, and Nora with excited questions about the chickens, the creek, and whether she could have a kitten of her own. I think that can be arranged, Isaac told her, laughing at her enthusiasm. The barn cats had kittens last month. They should be old enough to leave their mother by the time we get back. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity as they prepared for the journey back to Sweetwater. Martha arranged the sale of the boarding house to a couple from Denver who had been looking to establish themselves in Laramie. The proceeds would provide a comfortable cushion for their new life, ensuring that Grace and Nora would never again face the desperate circumstances that had led Grace to steal eggs from a stranger's henhouse. The night before their departure, as they sat together in Martha's parlor after Nora had gone to bed, Isaac found himself reflecting on the strange twists of fate that had brought them to this moment. If you hadn't chosen my henhouse to raid, if I hadn't happened to be checking the chickens at that exact moment. He mused. If you had reacted differently when you caught me, Grace added. Martha, who had been knitting quietly nearby, looked up with a smile. Some might call it chance, but I prefer to think of it as providence. Isaac, who had never been particularly religious despite his mother's best efforts, found himself inclined to agree. Whatever name it was given, the series of events that had brought Grace into his life seemed too perfect to be mere coincidence. Either way, he said, reaching for Grace's hand, I'm grateful. The journey back to Sweetwater was markedly different from their trip to Laramie, where before there had been uncertainty and the growing awareness of attraction. Now there was the shared excitement of beginning a new chapter together. Even the weather cooperated, providing clear skies and pleasant temperatures that made the traveling easy. Nora, freed from the anxiety that had made her so solemn before, revealed herself to be a lively, curious child with a natural affinity for the outdoor life. She delighted in identifying wildflowers, spotting animals, and asking endless questions about the ranch that would be her new home. Martha, too, seemed rejuvenated by the journey, her health visibly improving as they traveled. She confessed to Grace that the doctor had recommended country living and less stress, exactly what Isaac's farm would provide. For Isaac, watching the three women who would become his family interact brought a contentment he had never expected to find. Grace, especially, continued to surprise and impress him. Her practical knowledge, her quick wit, her obvious care for both Nora and Martha, and the increasingly affectionate glances she cast his way when she thought he wasn't looking. By the time they crested the final hill overlooking his property, Isaac found himself seeing his modest homestead through new eyes. The cabin that had sometimes seemed too quiet, too empty, now appeared full of possibilities. The barn, the corral, the chicken coop, the garden all would benefit from the care and attention of more hands, more hearts. There it is, he said, pointing. Home. Grace leaned slightly against his shoulder on the wagon seat. It's beautiful, Isaac. And somehow, with her beside him, it was. The weeks that followed were busy ones, filled with adjustments and arrangements as four individuals learned to become a family. Isaac set to work immediately expanding the cabin, adding 2 small bedrooms with the help of Jim and other neighbors who came willingly when they heard Isaac Porter had finally found himself a family. Grace proved herself as capable as Isaac had suspected, taking over the garden and chicken, keeping with practiced skill, while also transforming the cabin's interior into a true home. Curtains appeared at the windows, braided rugs on the floors, and flowers on the table, small touches that softened the bachelor austerity Isaac had lived with for so long. Martha, true to her word, thrived in the country setting. Her heart condition, while not cured, improved significantly with the quieter pace and fresh air. She took over much of the cooking, producing meals that made Isaac realize how poorly he had been feeding himself all these years. And Nora blossomed like a wildflower after rain. The solemn, anxious child gradually gave way to a laughing, curious girl who followed Isaac around the farm, helping with chores and charming him completely with her earnest efforts and endless questions. Through it all, Isaac and Grace's relationship deepened and strengthened. Working side by side, sharing responsibilities and decisions, they developed a partnership based on mutual respect and growing affection. In the evenings, after Nora was asleep and Martha had retired to her room, they would often sit together on the porch, talking quietly or simply enjoying each other's company in companionable silence. It was on such an evening, nearly 2 months after their return from Laramie, that Isaac finally asked the question that had been on his mind for weeks. "Grace," he said, his voice serious enough to make her turn toward him with questioning eyes. "I know we agreed to take things slowly, to be sure of our feelings before making any formal commitment." She nodded, setting aside the mending she had been working on. "We did. The thing is," Isaac continued, suddenly nervous despite the certainty in his heart, "I am sure I love you, Grace Donovan. I love your strength, your kindness, your practicality, and 100 other things I discover every day." Grace's eyes softened, but she let him continue. "I love the family we're building together, you, me, Nora, and Martha. And while I know we've only known each other a short time in the grand scheme of things, I can't imagine my life without you in it." Isaac reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. From it, he produced a simple gold ring set with a single small diamond that caught the last rays of the setting sun. "This was my mother's," he explained. "My father gave it to me before he died, saying it should go to the woman I chose to spend my life with." He took a deep breath. "I'm asking you to be that woman, Grace. Will you marry me?" Grace looked at the ring, then at Isaac's face, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Are you certain? It's not just because of Nora or the practical arrangements we've made." "I've never been more certain of anything," Isaac replied. "I want to be your husband, Nora's father, a proper family. Not just for practical reasons, but because I love you." A single tear escaped, trailing down Grace's cheek. "Then yes, Isaac Porter, I will marry you." Isaac slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms for a kiss that expressed all the love and hope and promise he felt in that moment. When they finally parted, both breathless and smiling, Grace rested her forehead against his. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have since you invited me to breakfast instead of calling the sheriff when you caught me stealing your eggs." Isaac laughed softly. "Best decision I ever made." Their wedding took place that autumn. A simple ceremony in the town church followed by a celebration at the farm attended by neighbors for miles around. Grace wore a new dress of deep blue, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Nora served as flower girl, scattering petals with such enthusiasm that several guests found them in their pockets days later. Martha, resplendent in her best dress from her boarding house days, cried happy tears throughout the ceremony. Isaac, watching Grace walk toward him down the church aisle, felt a profound gratitude for the strange twist of fate that had brought her to his henhouse that spring morning. What might have been a brief, unpleasant encounter between strangers had instead become the beginning of a love story neither of them could have anticipated. As they spoke their vows before the minister, Isaac held Grace's hands in his, marveling at how perfectly they fit together like her presence in his life. Unexpected but somehow exactly right. "I take you, Grace Donovan, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his voice steady and sure. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Grace's answering vows were equally firm, her green eyes never leaving his as she promised herself to him for all their days to come. Later, as they danced under lantern light in the farmyard cleared for the occasion, Isaac held his new wife close and whispered in her ear, "Happy, Mrs. Porter?" Grace looked up at him, her face alight with joy. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied. "And you?" "I have everything I never knew I needed," Isaac said simply. "You, Nora, Martha, are home. It's more than I dreamed of having." Over Grace's shoulder, He could see Nora teaching Jim's young son a spirited dance step while Martha watched from her chair of honor, tapping her foot in time to the fiddle music. Friends and neighbors moved around them, eating, drinking, celebrating the union of two people who had found each other against all odds. Who would have thought, Grace mused, following his gaze, that stealing eggs would lead to this? Isaac laughed, pulling her closer. Remind me to thank those chickens specially tomorrow. For laying the eggs? Grace asked, her eyes twinkling with amusement. For helping me find my heart, Isaac replied, and sealed the sentiment with a kiss as the music played on into the night. Epilogue 5 years later, the morning sun streamed through the curtained windows of the Porter farmhouse, now expanded to a comfortable 6 rooms with a wide, welcoming porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Isaac paused in the doorway of the kitchen, taking in the scene before him with quiet appreciation. Grace stood at the stove, her hair now streaked with a few strands of silver despite her relative youth pulled back in its usual practical braid. She was humming softly as she prepared breakfast, a sound that still made Isaac's heart lift even after 5 years of marriage. At the table, Nora, now 8 and growing tall, was helping 3-year-old James Porter his milk while simultaneously quizzing 6-year-old Elizabeth on her letters. Both children had Isaac's dark hair but Grace's green eyes, a combination that never failed to delight him. Martha sat in her special chair by the window, shelling peas for the evening meal and occasionally offering gentle corrections to Elizabeth's recitation. At 72, she remained a vital part of their household, though she moved more slowly now and sometimes needed to rest in the afternoons. The scene was so ordinary and yet so precious that Isaac hesitated to disturb it. These quiet moments of family life had become his greatest treasure, more valuable than the expanded herd of cattle that now grazed his enlarged property, more significant than the respected position he had gained in the community as it grew along with the territory. Grace looked up, sensing his presence, and smiled that same smile that had first captured his heart when she stood in his henhouse with stolen eggs in her apron. "Good morning, husband. Breakfast is nearly ready." "Papa!" James noticed him then, nearly spilling his milk in his excitement. "I helped with the chickens, all by myself." "With a little help," Nora amended, wiping up the splash of milk with practiced efficiency. Isaac crossed the room to ruffle his son's hair. "That's very impressive, James. Soon you'll be running the whole farm." "And I wrote my name," Elizabeth announced, not to be outdone. "Want to see?" "Of course I do," Isaac replied, crouching to admire the wobbly but recognizable letters his daughter had produced on her slate. As the family gathered around the table for breakfast, Isaac said the brief grace that had become their tradition, giving thanks for the food and for each other. Looking around at the faces of those he loved, he added a silent thanks for the unexpected path that had brought them all together. Later that morning, as he and Grace worked side by side in the garden, harvesting early vegetables for Martha to preserve, Isaac was reminded of that fateful day when he had caught a desperate young woman stealing eggs to feed her sister. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't caught you that day?" he asked, straightening from his work to watch Grace expertly select ripe tomatoes. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun with one hand. "Sometimes. I like to think we would have found each other eventually, though perhaps not as quickly or directly." "You believe we were meant to be together, then?" Isaac asked, intrigued by her certainty. Grace considered the question seriously, as she did most things. "I believe that people who are meant for each other often find ways to connect, even against unlikely odds." She smiled, the expression still capable of taking his breath away after all these years. "But I'm certainly glad you were checking your chickens at exactly the right moment." Isaac laughed, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering on her cheek. "So am I, Mrs. Porter. So am I." From the house came the sound of children's laughter, followed by Martha's gentle admonition not to run indoors. The routine sounds of their family life, ordinary but infinitely precious. "We've come a long way from stolen eggs," Grace observed, leaning briefly into his touch. "And we have a long way yet to go," Isaac replied, gesturing toward the thriving farm around them and the family they had built together. Grace nodded, her eyes full of the same love and commitment he felt every day. Together. The word was both a statement and a promise, one they had kept through good harvests and poor ones, through the births of their children, through illnesses and celebrations, through all the ordinary days and extraordinary moments that made up their shared life. Together, Isaac agreed, taking her hand in his as they walked back toward the house where their family waited the unexpected, perfect result of a chance encounter between a desperate young woman and a lonely farmer on a spring morning long ago.